are the wise? Who are the wise? Well, according to the book of Proverbs, not those with clever sound bites, but those who live good, full, complete lives. Those who live well. According to Proverbs, these people, wise people, love justice and hate injustice. And that isn't a surprise if you think about it logically. The fear of the Lord is the foundation of wisdom. God is a God who is righteous. God is a God who loves justice. It's the very basis of who he is. It's the very basis of his kingdom that we've been celebrating this morning. And so Psalm 89 says this: righteousness and justice are the foundation of your throne. That's why we've been praying our prayers for the persecuted church, for these nations. Because if God's kingdom is going to come, then actually these things are going to be resolved, because righteousness and justice are the foundation of your throne. Steadfast love and faithfulness go before you. God deals rightly and justly and fairly with us. Amen? And so therefore, he quite rightly expects us to behave in the same way towards him and others. And in the Bible, justice and righteousness are often linked. Righteousness, big word. It's used to describe in the Bible those who live in relationship with God, those who live in covenant relationship with God. It's just the way we behave if we are to live in relationship with him. There are proverbs about justice and righteousness scattered throughout the book, as you would expect. But there is one chapter where there is kind of more than their fair share. So we'll read that together. Proverbs 28. If you've got a Bible, turn to Proverbs chapter 28. And as we read these 28 verses of chapter 28, it kind of gives us a flavour also of the book. If you've never read Proverbs, you will see that through this particular chapter, Proverbs, they're not quite repeated, they're almost repeated. It's the same kind of proverb, but the other way round, making the same point, but in a different way. And then there are some kind of random ones thrown in there as well. So if you've got a Bible, follow. If not, just listen. Proverbs 28, the wicked man flees though no one pursues, but the righteous are as bold as a lion. There you go, that's one of those phrases, isn't it? Bold as a lion. Many of our English phrases are found in the Bible, aren't they? Many of them, bold as a lion. When a country is rebellious, it has many rulers, but a man of understanding and knowledge maintains order. A ruler who oppresses the poor is like a driving rain that leaves no crops. Those who forsake the law praise the wicked, but those who keep the law resist them. Evil men do not understand justice, but those who seek the Lord understand it fully. Better a poor man whose walk is blameless than a rich man whose ways are perverse. He who keeps the law is a discerning son, but a companion of gluttons disgraces his father. He who increases his wealth by exorbitant interest amasses it for another, who will be kind to the poor. If anyone turns a deaf ear to the law, even his prayers are detestable. He who leads the upright along an evil path will fall into his own trap, but the blameless will receive a good inheritance. A rich man may be wise in his own eyes, but a poor man who has discernment sees through him. When the righteous triumph, there is great elation, but when the wicked rise to power, men go into hiding. He who conceals his sins does not prosper, but whoever confesses and renounces them finds mercy. Blessed is the man who always fears the Lord, but he who hardens his heart falls into trouble. Like a roaring lion or a charging bear is a wicked man ruling over a helpless people. A tyrannical ruler lacks judgment, but he who hates ill-gotten gain will enjoy a long life. There's another one, isn't it? Ill-gotten gains. Verse 17, a man tormented by the guilt of murder will be a fugitive till death. Let no one support him. He whose walk is blameless is kept safe, but he whose ways are perverse will suddenly fall. He who works his land will have abundant food, but the one who chases fantasies will have his fill of poverty. A faithful man will be richly blessed, but one eager to get rich will not go unpunished. To show partiality is not good, yet a man will do wrong for a piece of bread. A stingy man is eager to get rich and is unaware that poverty awaits him. He who rebukes a man will in the end gain more favor than he who has a flattering tongue. He who robs his father or mother and says, "It's not wrong," he's a partner to him who destroys. A greedy man stirs up dissension, but he who trusts in the Lord will prosper. He who trusts in himself is a fool, but he who walks in wisdom is kept safe. He who gives to the poor will lack nothing, but he who closes his eyes to them receives many curses. When the wicked rise to power, people go into hiding, but when the wicked perish, the righteous thrive. So this morning, according to Proverbs, what does it look like when we hate injustice and love justice? And as a basis for this, I'm going to use an image that's repeated 4 times in Proverbs in slightly different forms, but it's the same message. One of my favourite little images, you find it in Proverbs 20. Who can say, "I've kept my heart pure, I'm clean and without sin"? Differing weights and differing measures, the Lord detests them both. Even small children are known by their actions. So is their conduct really pure and upright? And it's that middle one. Do you get the image? Do you get the image there? You've got a set of scales, and the scales work all right, but you also have a bag of weights. And in your bag of weights are 2 different versions of the weights, and you can tell the difference by the feel of them. They feel slightly different. One set are heavier than they should be, and the other set are lighter than they should be. So if you're buying something, which weight do you pull out? The heavier one, because you're going to get more that way. So it doesn't actually weigh a kilo or a pound. It weighs slightly more. So when you put it on your scales, you get more in return. But when you're selling, you put your hand in the bag, and by feeling, you feel the lighter one, and you bring that out. Very clever, isn't it? Very deceptive. Another version of that is found in Proverbs 16:11. Honest scales and balances belong to the Lord. All the weights in the bag are of his making. Do you get the idea? So what are some of the weights in the bag? What does just living look like in Proverbs? And what I wanted us to do this morning is to stick with the image, to feel the weight of some of these things, and to weigh them in our lives. Are we living this way? Because you see, it's easy for us in our lives to have 2 sets of weights, to deal with different people in different ways according to the circumstances. But actually, God calls us just to have 1 set of weights, to have a consistency in our lives. That's what just people do. So 3 characteristics, there's a surprise. 3 characteristics of just people. First of all, just people just do what is right, despite what the outcome might be. If you've got your Bible, have a look at 28 verse 6. Better a poor man whose walk is blameless than a rich man whose ways are perverse. And ways, again, suggest that he's got more than 1 set of weights in his bag. Different circumstances, he behaves or she behave in different ways. You get the point of that little parable? Because I'm not going to explain it, okay? But if you're going to live that way, it requires faith and courage. Faith to believe that God's way is always best, and then courage to actually live that way. Because many of us actually, we live our lives, and we're trained to do this from a young age. We work out what the different conclusions might be. So if we do this, then it's likely to end up with this. But if we do, no, we're going to go this way. But actually, just people just do what is right, despite the outcome. We do it because we know it's right, and that's enough for us. Dirk Willems, you may know this story, was an Anabaptist Christian living in Holland about 500 years ago. He was arrested for standing against the corruption of the state church. The state church was really just a political instrument. He was arrested, he was on trial, and he managed to escape. And as he was fleeing across the winter fields, he fled across a frozen pond. He was being chased, and he heard behind him this great cracking sound as the ice cracked, and then this splash as the man who was pursuing him, the guard, fell into the water. And then he heard the guard shouting for help. What would you do? If you know the story, he went back and helped him, because the words going through his mind were, love your enemies, do good to those who persecute you. Of course, he was rearrested and he was burnt at the stake, despite the fact that the guard pleaded for him. Just people just do what is right, despite the outcome. And we've heard stories this morning of the persecuted church all over the world now. Our brothers and sisters are just doing what's right. That's what they're committed to. This requires courage. In 28 verse 1, the wicked man flees, though no one pursues, but the righteous are as bold as a lion. It's a lovely image again, isn't it, of wicked people continually looking over their shoulder, even though there's nobody there. But the righteous, those who live in that relationship with God freely and openly, where there is no gap, then we have nothing to be afraid of. Because surely goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life. And then 28 verse 18, he whose walk is blameless is kept safe, but he whose ways are perverse will suddenly fall. But well, wait a minute. I've just told you a story about a man who did what was right. Where was his protection when he was burnt at the stake? What did Jesus say? Do not fear those who kill the body but cannot kill the soul. Rather fear him who can destroy both soul and body in hell. Yeah, we are kept safe, but actually safety is more than just this life, isn't it? It's much more important to be safe for eternity. And God keeps us safe. What kind of reward do you think Dirk Willem had from the just judge? But doing the right thing is also balanced with humility. See, people who always do the right thing can be quite hard to live with, can't they? People who are always right can be quite hard to live with, but people who always do the right thing, they can be tough to live with. Bernard Cornwell, some of you will know him. Some of you won't know him, you'll have just seen Sharp on the television, but he wrote the Sharp novels and a number of other historical novels. He was adopted by a family in Essex who were a Christian sect. And he writes of the beatings that he received from his stepfather, who was a man who was determined about justice. He also writes about what he never saw in this stepfather, that actually there was a longing for joy and other things, but he never saw it. You see, people who just do the right thing and that only can be very hard to live with. And what we also find in this passage is not just justice, but humility. Verse 13, he who conceals his sin does not prosper, but whoever confesses and renounces them finds mercy. Verse 14, blessed is the man who always fears the Lord, but he who hardens his heart falls into trouble. Verse 26, he who trusts in himself is a fool, but he who walks in wisdom is kept safe. See, justice and humility, actually justice, humility, and mercy, you often find together in the Bible. Together they are beautiful, separated, they just don't work. I mean, as I've always said, justice on its own is very hard. When you get humility and mercy without justice, actually you just get something that is so soft that it's no use to anybody. When you bring them together, you get something incredibly powerful, and you get a little glimpse of what the kingdom of God is like. You know that well-known account, don't you, of what happened in post-apartheid South Africa, about that black lady whose husband and son had been murdered by a white South African police officer. He was eventually caught. He was found guilty. And this is what the widow, this is what the mother said to the judge. He took my family away from me, and I still have a lot of love to give. He needs to know what love and grace feel like. So I think he should come to visit my home in the slums twice a month and spend time with me so I can be a mother to him, so that I can embrace him and he can know that my forgiveness is real. There's justice, humility, and mercy there. And isn't it a beautiful thing? Isn't it a beautiful thing when those things come together? Because people who love justice love God. And actually, people who love justice in this way are not worrying about justice for themselves. They're worrying about justice for others, in the sure and certain knowledge that he will take care of justice for us. You get that? They're less worried about justice for themselves because they can trust God about that. But they are concerned about justice for others, which is why, secondly, just people just have a heart for the poor. And this is seen consistently throughout the Bible. It's seen in the Old Testament law, it's seen in the Psalms, it's seen here in the wisdom literature, it's seen here in the Old Testament prophets, it's seen in the life and teachings of Jesus, and surprise, surprise, in the teaching and practice of the early church. A heart for the poor. It's there stamped throughout God's revealed word. And we find it in chapter 28 and verse 27. He who gives to the poor will lack nothing. He who closes his eyes to them receives many curses. And then in the next chapter, 29 verse 7, the righteous care about justice for the poor, but the wicked have no such concern. Justice for the poor can apply at many different levels in our lives. It's a local issue. It's also an international issue. But ultimately, it's not an issue, is it? It's about people. We'll come back to that in a moment. But some questions. Who are the poor? How does our culture view the poor and their plight? And how are we influenced by that? What does God say? Where and how can I make a difference? Because there's no shortage of possibilities, are there? From fair trade through to compassion to Samaritan's Purse, and we'll be launching the Shoebox Appeal in a couple of weeks' time. Local issues like food bank and so on. There's no shortage of possibilities. But remember, justice for the poor is not an issue. It's not a project. It's about people. And actually, as we encounter poverty, that, I think, is one of the most powerful impacts in our lives. And those of you who have helped in the food bank, it's been a transforming experience, hasn't it? Thank you, yeah. I know it is because you've talked to me about it. As you've met people, actually in extreme situations, in circumstances not of their choosing and often not of their making, it's had a transforming impact upon you. It's one of the ways in which we grow in this area, in growing a heart for the poor, is by encountering people who are experiencing poverty. Several years ago, the churches in the town where we lived were involved in one of those campaigns. It was the campaign about the issue of international debt, which is about justice for the poor. And what we were encouraging people to do was, in the high street in that town, we set up a voting booth. And you could vote, we had a little card, and you could vote that actually the debt should be dropped. And we collected all the cards and we sent them off to our local MP. And whilst we were canvassing passers-by to come and do this thing, one man said to me, "No, I'm not prepared to vote for that." So I asked the dangerous question, which was, why? And he said, he didn't use these words, but effectively what he said to me was, "I am an unemployed, white, working-class local man." And he felt utterly forgotten and abandoned. And he said to me, "If you want me to come and vote for the British National Party, I will do that, because they are the only people who show any interest in me." Now, I didn't agree with his solution, but I encountered something in him that surprised me. Because you see, poverty takes many different forms, doesn't it? And actually, it's all around us. But often we don't have eyes to see and to spot it. He wasn't rude or unpleasant, but he got his message across. Do we give these hidden people the same weight in our lives as influential people? Those of you who are at work tomorrow, do you give the same weight to the cleaner as you do to the person you work for? Or have you got two different weights in your bag? Are we even seeing these insignificant people because they're all around? All too easily, unconsciously, we divide people into those who matter and those who don't. And the kingdom of God does not view people like that. If you want to read a book that will challenge you in this whole area, then, and I'm thankful to Andrew Frere Smith for lending me this, The Irresistible Revolution by Shane Claiborne. And you can get that through the usual source, which is just at the end of the drive. And over the road there, which is Green Pastures, The Irresistible Revolution. You won't agree with everything that Shane Claiborne says. But I think that's the point of the book. It makes you think. And at least this is a man who is living it. This is a man who was so incensed when his government invaded Iraq, is an American, that he went and lived there, in amongst the bombs, to demonstrate his solidarity with the poor, with the oppressed, and survived to tell the tale. Right. Remember that God knows and God sees. Proverbs 23, verse 10, do not move an ancient landmark or enter the fields of the fatherless, for their Redeemer is strong. He will plead their cause against you. Just people just have a heart for the poor. And then thirdly, just people just guard what they say. Just people take care to tell the truth. Again, truth-telling is about having the same weight, isn't it? That in all circumstances, we tell the truth. We don't have different weights in our bag. Proverbs 19, verse 5, a false witness will not go unpunished, and he who breathes out lies will not escape. But secondly, just people avoid malicious gossip. And it's not in our passage, but I'll read it to you. It's from chapter 26. And this describes gossip down to a T. For lack of wood, the fire goes out. And where there's no whisperer, quarrelling ceases. As charcoal to hot embers and wood to fire, so is a quarrelsome man for kindling strife. The words of a whisperer are like delicious morsels. They go down into the inner parts of the body. You've never received gossip like that, have you? As a delicious morsel to chew over. I can see from your faces you don't know what I'm talking about. Like the glaze covering an earthen vessel are fervent lips with an evil heart. Whoever hates disguises himself with his lips and harbours deceit in his heart. When he speaks graciously, believe him not, for there are 7 abominations in his heart. Though his hatred be covered with deception, his wickedness will be exposed in the assembly. Whoever digs a pit will fall into it, and a stone will come back on him who starts it rolling. A lying tongue hates its victims, and a flattering mouth works ruin. Does our tongue ultimately betray the truth about ourselves? Like the glaze covering an earthen vessel, are fervent lips with an evil heart. They're beautifully decorated pots, but actually underneath, they're just earthenware vessels. And all too easily, we can cover up what's going on in our hearts. But ultimately, what's in our hearts comes out through our mouths. We can only hold on to it for so long. And so one of the warnings is, give attention to your heart. And if you're aware that what's coming out of your mouth is not very helpful, you're just not going to get away with this, are you? Because eventually it comes out. You need to give attention to your heart. You need to ask God, why? Why? Why am I feeling and thinking like this? Will you show me the root of this, that I might have healing? We need to guard our hearts, because as Jesus says, the overflow of our hearts so often is our mouths. But also, the second question is, how do we respond to gossip? You know, this whole thing about it's a choice morsel. I could see from your faces, you knew that, you recognize that. And there are times when we kind of delight in that thing. But actually, just people don't. Just people will not receive that kind of gossip. So how are we going to deal with that? Well, and there's that lovely phrase, isn't there, that it talks about, as charcoal to hot embers and wood to fire. How are we going to pour cold water on this? Actually, when somebody comes up to you and starts that, or tells you, then what you can do is you can begin to ask a few questions. That just shows that actually there are always two sides, aren't there? There's always two sides when you're told something unhelpful about somebody, isn't there? Or you can do what a friend of mine used to do, and I watched him do this, and you could see it was like taking a big pin and sticking it in a balloon. You could see the person's face deflate in front of them. What he used to do was, as soon as he heard something negative coming out about this other person, he would interrupt. And he would say something really positive about that person. Oh, so-and-so, do you know, I found them really, really helpful. And you can just see, they don't want to tell you the gossip then. Because it's just been before it's even started. We can allow it to be a choice morsel. And there's nothing more destructive in a church than gossip. And actually, in many churches, it is accepted practice. Let's be honest. It's normal behaviour. Actually, we've got something to learn from our Brazilian and Portuguese friends here, because they don't gossip behind one another's backs. They confront one another, which is not very English or British, but actually it's much healthier in the long run. And we need to, as God's people, we need not to accept this any longer, do we? So I'm not accusing anybody, and I'm not addressing a particular situation. I'm just aware, British culture, it's acceptable to gossip about people, and therefore it tends to find its way into the church. I wasn't intending to say this, I'm going off on one, but let's not accept it. Let's nip it in the bud. They're not choice morsels, they're poison. Let's recognise it for what it is. So wise people live full and complete lives. They love justice. They love justice. They just do what's right, despite what the outcome is. They just have a heart for the poor, and they just guard what they say. That all sounds a bit, if you're not careful, negative. I want to end with a positive, which actually sounds like a negative to start with, but 28 verse 9. If anyone turns a deaf ear to the law, that is God's instruction, that is what God is saying. If anyone turns a deaf ear to the law, even his prayers are detestable. James flips that on its head, doesn't he, in James 5:16. The prayer of a righteous person is powerful and effective. Just people who love justice and hate injustice, have God's ear. You got that? People who love justice and hate injustice have God's ear. Because justice and righteousness are the very foundation of God's throne. Let's sing about the reign of God in our final song. And the children are escaping, so it's bang on cue. Great is the Lord, and most worthy of praise. Let's stand together, shall we?